The motion before us that the demographic transition, the sequence from high mortality and high fertility through falling death rates, then falling birth rates, to population stabilization, is the dominant explanatory variable for economic development, political stability, and geopolitical power over the last 2 centuries. That understanding where a country sits in this arc predicts more than any other single factor. At the table, 3 thinkers whose methods could not be more different. The empiricist arrives at questions by testing them against what can actually be known, distinguishing rigorously between correlation, causation, and the stories we tell when the data runs out. The geographer thinks in terms of place and particularity, the specific human consequences of large-scale patterns, and whether the pattern holds when you name the village. The essayist watches for the behavioral shift beneath the statistical one, the moment when what millions of people do quietly constitutes a revolution no manifesto announced. What is at stake is not merely academic. We are speaking in 2026. Japan has not seen positive natural population growth since 2007. South Korea's fertility rate fell below 1 child per woman in 2018 and has not recovered. Sub-Saharan Africa's median age is 19. The Mediterranean is a demographic frontier. China's working-age population peaked in 2015. India's median age is 28, and the geopolitical order of the next 50 years may be written in birth registries more clearly than in any treaty. The question is whether demography is the deep structure beneath the surface politics, or whether we are mistaking one variable in a system for the system itself. I invite the empiricist to open.
The motion asks us to crown a single variable king. That should make us suspicious immediately. Here is what we know. Britain between 1750 and 1850. Infant mortality falls from roughly 250 per 1,000 live births to 150 die. Fertility remains high until the 1870s, then drops sharply. During that 100-year lag, you get the Industrial Revolution, the factory system, mass urbanization, and the fiscal military state that will dominate a quarter of the globe. France follows a different sequence entirely. Fertility begins declining in the 1780s, before industrialization, before mortality falls substantially, before anything the demographic transition model predicts. By 1850, French fertility is below replacement in some regions, while infant mortality remains at 180 per 1,000. France industrializes anyway, more slowly, along a different path. Sweden keeps records we can trust from 1750 forward. Mortality falls first, 1810 onward. Fertility stays high until the 1880s. The gap is 70 years. What happens in that 70 years? The emergence of a literate smallholder class, proto-democratic institutions, early welfare mechanisms. Which came first, the institutions that made the mortality decline possible, or the demographic pressure that forced the institutional innovation? Now test the strong version of the motion. If demography is the dominant variable, it should predict well. Bangladesh in 1980, total fertility rate 6.6 children per woman. Infant mortality 129 per 1,000. Textbook pre-transition. Prediction: decades of instability, poverty trap, Malthusian crisis. Actual outcome: fertility falls to 2.0 by 2020, infant mortality to around 28 per 1,000. Garment exports rise from nothing to 35 billion annually, female labor force participation quadruples. The transition happened, but it happened because of microfinance institutions, NGO-driven female literacy programs, and export-oriented industrialization. The demographic outcome was the consequence, not the cause. The motion conflates 2 claims. First, that all industrialized countries have passed through this transition. True and unremarkable. Second, that the transition explains industrialization more than any other variable. That second claim is falsifiable. Find me a country that industrialized because its mortality fell, rather than a country whose mortality fell because it built sewers, vaccines, and grain markets. The direction of causation is everything. I do not see the evidence settling it.
The empiricist is entirely correct to doubt the clean, linear story. The causal arrow from fewer deaths to fewer births to national wealth is too simple. It treats a country as a single unit, a statistical container that smoothly transitions from one state to another. But a country is not a container. It is a landscape. And the demographic transition is a profoundly geographic event, one that happens unevenly, creating immense internal pressures. It does not happen to Turkey. It happens first to Istanbul and Izmir, and much later, or perhaps never, to the villages around Van. The critical variable is not the national fertility rate, but the gradient, the steepness of the demographic cliff between the modernizing core and the traditional periphery. That divergence is the engine of modern history. Consider Fatma Yilmaz, a young woman who leaves her family's farm outside Diyarbakir in 1985. In her village, the total fertility rate is still over 5 children per woman. She moves to a new industrial zone in Gebze, outside Istanbul, to work in a textile factory. There, among women like her, the fertility rate is already approaching 2. Her decision to move, to work for a wage, and to have 2 children instead of the 6 her mother had is the demographic transition in miniature. But her journey is also one of immense dislocation. She has crossed a border that is not on any official map, but is more real than most. Her children will grow up in a city of 15 million, speaking a different dialect of Turkish, with loyalties to a different political party than her cousins who remain behind. The tension between her new world and the one she left is the central story of Turkish politics for the past 40 years. It is the story of Italy's north versus its Mezzogiorno, of Brazil's São Paulo state versus its northeast. The motion is not wrong, it is simply looking at the wrong map. The aggregate national numbers the empiricist rightly questions are a faint echo of the real event. The event itself is spatial. It is the wrenching, often violent creation of 2 countries inside one. And the clean, sequential model collapses further still when we examine cases that confound the assumed mechanism. Japan's fertility began falling in the Meiji-era cities of Osaka and Tokyo, a full generation before rural prefectures like Akita or Iwate had completed their epidemiological transition. Before child mortality, there had fallen decisively at all. The city was already demographically post-industrial while the countryside remained pre-modern, and the national aggregate concealed both realities behind a single misleading number. This is not a footnote to the theory. It is a structural challenge to any model that presents the transition as a tidy national sequence rather than a jagged, contested internal geography.
The shared assumption is that populations will follow the expected sequence once mortality declines, because the underlying decisions about family formation are treated as automatic responses to economic or institutional conditions. What the data show instead is that millions are simply refusing to form the households the model requires. In Britain, the share of women born in the late 1970s who reach age 45 without children stands near 22%, more than double the rate for women born in the 1940s. The same cohorts show median age at first birth above 31. These are not marginal adjustments. They are sustained choices visible in marriage registers, housing applications, and tax filings. The result is that total period fertility has fallen below 1.6 in recent years, even as real incomes and housing stock recovered after 2010. The stabilization phase, the motion assumes, does not arrive when the arithmetic predicts it should. The same pattern appears at different speeds wherever young adults can afford to live independently without marrying. In the Czech Republic, the proportion of 30-year-olds living with parents rose from 28% in 2000 to 41% in 2019. Completed fertility for those cohorts is tracking toward 1.5. In Chile, female labor force participation above secondary education crossed 55% by 2015, and the share of births to unmarried mothers exceeded 70%. Yet completed family size for university-educated women born after 1980 sits at 1.3. These are revealed preferences, not data errors. The motion therefore misplaces the causal weight. Mortality decline creates the possibility of smaller families. It does not compel them. When enough people elect to postpone or forego partnership altogether, the later stages of the supposed arc slow or stall regardless of further income growth. That behavioral threshold, not the mortality schedule itself, now separates countries whose working age populations will continue to shrink from those whose fertility can still be coaxed upward. You claim that the direction of causation is everything, and that mortality fell because states built sewers, vaccines, and grain markets. How do you account for the fact that total fertility in the German Democratic Republic stood around 1.6 by 1975, higher than the Federal Republic's rate at the time, which had fallen below 1.1, while both states inherited identical pre-war industrial capacity and public health infrastructure, and while East German per capita income remained far below West German levels?
The GDR example cuts directly at what I overstated. I claimed institutional capacity precedes the fertility decline. You have shown me two states with identical inherited infrastructure producing radically different fertility outcomes within a generation. The sharper claim, institutional arrangements determine which populations internalize the costs of fertility. East German women bore state child care, but also compulsory employment and housing queues that penalized larger families. But your own data betray the motion's overreach. If East Germany reached 1.6 by 1975, while still roughly 15 years from collapse, and if Britain's cohorts born in the late 1970s show sustained below replacement fertility through income recovery, then where is the stabilization? The motion promises an arc. You have described a cliff with no bottom yet visible. Here is what you should ask yourself. If fertility can fall this far, this fast, absent material constraint, purely through preference shift, what makes you confident any floor exists at all? You claim the gradient between modernizing core and traditional periphery is the engine of modern history. But gradients narrow. Italy's total fertility rate in 1952 stood at 2.3 children per woman, substantially above Northern Europe, while its south ran higher still. By 2010, the entire country sat at around 1.46, from Lombardy to Calabria. The spatial divergence you describe as the explanatory mechanism has collapsed into convergence at sub-replacement levels across regions that were a century apart in economic development. If the gradient was the engine, what drives the system after the gradient disappears?
You have caught me. The grand regional gradient between Lombardy and Calabria has indeed faded as an explanation, but the divergence has not vanished. It has collapsed inwards, inside the city walls. Consider Matteo, a logistics manager who commutes 90 minutes from a satellite town into central Milan. His choice to have one child, not two, is not an abstract preference shift. It is a calculation of time and space, the hours on the train, the price of an apartment near a good school, the distance from his parents who might have helped. The landscape of his decision is the city's transport map. You look for a shift in values and see a cliff with no bottom. I find a punishing new geography, and that is floor enough. The essayist, you describe a fundamental shift in desire, a new settled preference for the small family. The Hungarian state has wagered 5% of its annual GDP that you are wrong. It offers lifetime tax exemption to mothers with 4 children and vast, subsidized loans for housing. The result has been a grudging lift in fertility from roughly 1.2 to just under 1.6. The policy gives a young couple a check. It does not give them a third bedroom in a desirable district of Debrecen. If the decisive change is in the human heart, why does this vast social experiment seem to break not on the shoals of ideology, but on the price per square meter?
Your question forces a useful adjustment. Subsidies can indeed move some couples across the threshold from 1 child to 2 when partnership has already formed. The sharper pattern surfaces in the rising share of young adults who never enter that threshold at all. European survey data show the share reporting an intention to remain childless rising meaningfully as adults move through their late 20s and early 30s, even in contexts where Scandinavian parental leave entitlements have expanded substantially in recent years. The intention forms before the policy instrument is tested and survives its partial activation. That sequence places the causal weight on the prior redefinition of adulthood rather than on the later benefit calculation.
The question you have been circling is this: if the demographic transition was ever a predictable sequence, Has it now become a one-way ratchet that no policy can reverse and no theory fully explains? We are speaking in 2026. South Korea has spent $270 billion over 16 years trying to raise its fertility rate. It has fallen from 1.2 to 0.72. Singapore offers 100,000 in direct subsidies per child. Japan's population has declined by 3 million since 2010, despite every fiscal instrument the state possesses. The Hungarian experiment the geographer mentioned is the most aggressive in Europe, and it has bought half a child per woman at a cost that cannot scale. So the question for this table: are we inside the first fertility collapse in human history that no human society knows how to escape? And if we are, if this is not a transition with a stable end state, but a trapdoor that closes behind you, are we the kind of people who can say so before the demographics of 2050 are already inevitable?
The question is not whether we can escape, but what it is we are trying to escape from. The image of a trap suggests a hidden mechanism, a sudden closing of a door. I think the physics of materials offers a better model: hysteresis. A metal that has been magnetized does not simply forget that magnetism when the current is switched off. To demagnetize it, you must apply a contrary force, often a stronger one. The path back is not the path that led you here. We are looking for the source of this irreversibility in the wrong places, in national accounts or surveys of desire. Let us look instead at a riverbed. The Zayanda River, which for millennia gave life to the city of Isfahan in Iran, is now dry for most of the year. This is not a metaphor. Iran, a country that engineered one of the most rapid fertility declines in history, is now spending enormous political capital trying to reverse it. Consider Navid, a 32-year-old coppersmith in Isfahan's Grand Bazaar. His craft is ancient, his calculations are modern. He and his wife have one child. The government in Tehran, desperate for a demographic recovery, offers them loans and priority for public housing if they have a second or third. But Navid sees the tankers bringing water into his neighborhood. He knows the pistachio groves his uncle tended are now salt-crusted earth. He has seen the protests by farmers who have lost everything to the vanished river. The state is sending one signal written in currency. The watershed is sending another written in dust. The official map says this is a nation of 88 million poised for growth. The hydrological map says this is a civilization contracting to the thin perimeter of its remaining water. Navid's choice is not an expression of some new postmodern sensibility. It is an act of profound environmental realism. You cannot reverse this with a tax credit. To reverse it, you would have to make the river flow again.
The geographer's river captures a genuine constraint, yet it still treats the decision as a direct response to visible scarcity. What the behavioral record shows instead is that low fertility has become self-reinforcing through the transmission of norms inside families and workplaces, even where water, wages, and housing are no longer the binding limit. National registers in several high-income countries now record completed fertility among women whose own mothers had 2 children falling to roughly 1.4, while women whose mothers had 3 or more still average near 1.9, despite identical average incomes and schooling. The gap survives controls for current resources and appears in both water-scarce and water-abundant districts. The pattern repeats across cohorts that never face the environmental pressure Navid confronts. This intergenerational handoff is the mechanism that turns a temporary adjustment into a durable equilibrium. Once enough parents socialize their children to treat early household formation as a risk rather than a default, the next generation applies the same script under conditions the previous one would have called abundant. Historical parallels appear in the urban professional classes of late 19th century France, where completed family size among the educated remained below replacement for 3 successive generations after real wages and urban sanitation had both risen sharply. The implication is that material restoration alone, whether of rivers or subsidies, encounters a prior filter. The filter is not ideology, but the accumulated weight of observed parental outcomes that now shape what counts as prudent timing. Reversing that filter would require altering the lived models of successful adulthood inside the same networks that currently reproduce the lower schedule.
The essayist describes norm transmission as if it were a social fact we observe and record. But we should ask, what is the mechanism? How precisely does a preference survive the removal of its original constraint? Ecology gives us a test case. The vole populations of Fennoscandia cycle with extraordinary regularity. Boom, crash, boom, on a 3 to 4 year period that has persisted since records began in the 1920s. For decades, the assumed driver was predation. More voles, more foxes. Fox population overshoots. Voles crash. Foxes starve. Voles recover. Remove the predators experimentally, and the cycle should flatten. It does not. Enclosed vole populations with zero predation continue to cycle. The mechanism is maternal stress. Females experiencing high-density conditions during pregnancy produce offspring with altered stress hormone profiles. Those offspring, even when raised in uncrowded conditions with unlimited food, show delayed sexual maturation and smaller litters. The constraint that no longer exists in the environment persists as an inherited physiological response. Now return to the Essayist's Dutch panel data. Intention to remain childless rising sharply across cohorts even where housing costs fell. If we take that seriously, if it is not a survey artifact but a genuine durable shift, then we are looking at something analogous. The generation that formed its expectations during the constraint period transmits not merely a norm, but a recalibrated baseline for what counts as security. But the analogy breaks precisely where it matters. Vole populations recover when density falls for long enough, typically 3 generations. The stress hormone profile resets. Human fertility has now been below replacement in Italy for 48 consecutive years, in Spain for 46. If there is a reset mechanism, we have not yet seen it operate at the scale of a wealthy industrialized nation. The Geographer's riverbed captures a constraint that remains binding. The Essayist's intergenerational filter captures a constraint that has become self-perpetuating. What we do not yet have is a single observed case of reversal that does not depend on immigration, coercion, or economic collapse severe enough to restore subsistence-level conditions. That absence is the empirical fact the motion cannot accommodate. The transition was supposed to stabilize. It has not stabilized. It has overshot, and we have no prior example of recovery.
Norms once transmitted across generations do not unwind when the original pressures lift. Consider instead the post-famine dietary conservatism documented in Western Irish communities through the early 20th century. Households that had achieved moderate prosperity continued to restrict egg and dairy consumption for decades after scarcity ended, the behavior having been encoded as prudential habit rather than calculated response to present conditions. No analogous behavioral liberation has appeared in any tracked industrial society once fertility fell below replacement. The timetable, once installed, does not self-correct. British cohort studies show daughters of mothers who postponed first birth past age 30 now schedule their own first births at the same median age or later, even when their own earnings and housing access exceed their mothers at equivalent life stages. The pattern holds after statistical controls for income, education, and regional cost of living. It appears in both the high-pressure urban cores and the lower-pressure rural districts that the earlier debate already mapped. The mechanism is therefore not scarcity itself, but the internalized timetable of prudent adulthood passed from parent to child. Material restoration alone encounters that timetable as an inherited filter rather than an open choice. The transition model was constructed from a data set of descent, not of recovery. It described a direction of travel, not an equilibrium to which populations subsequently returned. What the longitudinal record across South Korea, Spain, and Canada now shows instead is a schedule that continues to compress regardless of whether housing costs ease or parental leave expands, its lower bound still undiscovered after multiple cohorts have passed through it.
The essayist speaks of an internalized timetable of prudent adulthood. In a village in the Spanish province of Soria, that timetable is being rendered in concrete and steel. Anna, a municipal architect, is managing the conversion of the local primary school. It had 3 classrooms and educated the village for 70 years. Its last 5 pupils were transferred to a regional hub last autumn. Her plans will turn it into a day center and residential facility for the district's over 80s, a population which grows by 3% a year. Anna is 38. She and her partner have no children. There was no single agonized conversation. There was only the ambient evidence of her own work, reviewing permits to demolish farmhouses that have no heirs, consolidating water mains for a population half the size they were designed for, turning a place of learning into a place of dying. The transition model we began with assumed a country moves from one state to a stable next. It forgot the landscape of the journey. You do not need an inherited stress hormone, as the empiricist voles did, when the future is written in a municipal brief. The endpoint of the arc is not stabilization. It is an architect, quietly designing a world with no children in it.
What changed for me was the geographer's river, not the scarcity itself, constraint as driver I already believed, but the detail about Almeria's desalination dependency. Infrastructure built for a population that is no longer arriving, staffed by technicians whose children have moved to Valencia. That was the moment I stopped asking whether fertility would stabilize, and started asking what stabilization could possibly mean in a landscape being redesigned around a demographic that is leaving rather than reproducing. I came in skeptical of crowning demography king. I leave more disturbed by what we have not named, that we may be measuring the wrong transition. The classical model tracks a society moving from one equilibrium to another. What if we are instead measuring the time it takes for a society to discover it has designed institutions that cannot persist? Consider the Swedish pension system, reformed in 1999 to automatic balancing. Benefits adjust downward when the ratio of contributors to recipients falls. Elegant on paper. By 2019, the mechanism had triggered cuts 3 times. Each cut was technically sustainable. None was politically survivable at scale. The coalition government fell in 2022, partly over the pension question, and the reform's architects now acknowledge the automatic stabilizer assumed a demographic floor that has not appeared. That is not a transition. That is a society learning in real time that the promise it made to itself cannot be kept. The question this debate should have asked, can you see institutional failure coming from inside the institution? Or is that always invisible until the day the maternity ward closes, the tax base shrinks past the bond covenant, and someone finally says aloud what the spreadsheets have been saying quietly for a decade?